Hello, and welcome to the Blackmagic RAW workshop. My name is Jesse Kester. Today we're going to be talking about Blackmagic cameras, Blackmagic RAW. Let's talk about RAW as an acquisition format and what it does that other acquisition formats don't do. So if you're shooting on a Canon, Nikon, or a Sony, you're going to be shooting probably H.264, maybe H.265. But definitely not ProRes and definitely not RAW. I speak too much, I say too much with too much confidence. I am sure modern, like Canon has their own C-RAW, Nikon has their own RAW format that's in their higher end cameras. But if you're starting out with like a 5D or something at the Sony Alpha, you're not getting any RAW codecs in the camera. And RAW opens up this huge world of control in post-production that you simply cannot get with non-RAW formats. Even with something as high fidelity as ProRes, you lose a lot of the RAW control. So first thing we're going to do is talk about what you get with RAW that you don't get with more compressed codecs like H.264, ProRes, and other codecs like that. The first thing you get is much greater control over your ISO, and we're going to go back to the days of film as we talk about ISO, and then we'll carry it up through digital photography and cinematography. And ISO is nothing more than a system of measuring the light sensitivity of a film stock, and it will give you a general idea of how much noise there will be in your image. Like the lower the ISO number is, the less sensitive it is to light, but the finer the grain is. There is a formula for figuring out what your ISO is. If you held a gun to my head, I could not explain this to you. I have no clue what that means. I looked it up, tried to break it down, could not figure it out. So we're just going to skip that and get to the more practical physical aspect of it. Film stock was like this. This is what film stock is. It's a sheet of plastic with a bunch of chemicals on top. The layer of chemicals that we care about is the emulsion layer. And on black and white film, this has silver halide crystals. And how this works is the crystals react to light. And the smaller these crystals are, the less likely they are to react to light. The more light they need to get a reaction. The larger these crystals are, the quicker they'll react to light. And what that looks like is this. ISO 100 has a very fine grain. It has very small halide crystals, which means that it needs a lot of light to get a reaction. What you're seeing on the right is 3200, and just looking at the two of those, if you direct your attention to the gradients, if you look underneath that pier, you can see a highlight to shadow gradient, and it's pretty fine. And if you look at the other one, when you look at the highlight to shadow gradients, you're seeing a lot more grain. The reason you're seeing more grain is because the halide crystals are physically larger. What you're seeing there are the halide crystals. They're very large, and that means that they react to less light. So in a darker environment, you want larger crystals because they are less reactive to light. The bigger the crystals are, the easier they are to see in your image. So that's what you're seeing, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about grain and ISO, is how fine these crystals are. This is back in the days of film, what we were talking about. And here's a close-up shot, so you can really see just how large those chunky bits of grain are on the 3200 as compared to the 100. Let's fast forward to the world of digital photography and native ISOs. So digital photography is a little bit different from film photography, and we've got a much oversimplified breakdown of how digital photography works. So it starts at the sensor plate, and if you want to see one, we can actually, let's look at one right now. You've probably seen these before. Right inside there, that's the sensor plate, that little kind of greenish looking thing that glows rainbow as you pass light over it. And all the sensor plate does is quantify the photons that are hitting it. It's a very passive device. All it can do is look at the world, count the photons in front of it, and report that back to the camera's processor. And the chain through which it reports that is sensor plate to a gain, an amplifier. And it's a fixed gain amplifier. And that is what creates your native ISO. This amplifier works at one one level of amplification, and that's it. After it passes through that amplifier, it goes to an analog to digital converter, then it goes through digital gain, and then it can be recorded. That digital gain is where you get on your cameras ISO 100, 200, 400, 1000, 1250. That's where you get the range of ISOs on your camera. You do not get any of that before the analog to digital conversion. That analog gain is your camera's native ISO. And you might have heard this term before, like a Canon 5D, native ISO 800. I believe that micro is 800, it might be 400. These are a little different, and we'll get into those second. And when you noodle with the ISO, what you're doing is taking that one, the one report of photons hitting the sensor, and you're either amplifying that signal or you're attenuating that signal. And when you amplify the signal, you drag all the noise up with it, and when you attenuate that signal, you push all the noise down with it, but you also lose visual information, and we'll get into how that works in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about pulling that signal up and pushing it down from the native ISO. As you amplify, you take noise with you, so the more you amplify, the more noise you're going to have in your image. This is ISO 400. There's very, very little noise. I'm going to kick this up to much higher ISO, and then we're going to close down the iris a lot. But you can see in the beam, do you see all that noise? The image is not nearly as clean. There's a lot of kind of flickery noise. That's digital grain. And the relationship between signal amplification and an increase in grainy noise is so similar between digital cameras that we use the same nomenclature as analog cameras. That covers that. The big question that comes out of this then is where do you set your camera in terms of ISO? And the best answer I can come up with is to set it to the native ISO, if you can. Because that's where your camera performs the best, and we will get into the compromises made. Let me back that sentence up. That's where the camera operates the best, because as you go above the ISO, you are amplifying noise along with the signal. So any trip you make up to higher ISOs will introduce more and more noise to your image, and the least amount of noise is the best amount of noise. When you're shooting RAW, you're collecting the information from the sensor plate immediately after the analog to digital converter. And that means that in post, you can adjust your ISO and it will be identical to any adjustments you would have made in camera. So when you add digital gain and then you bake it into the file, you can't change the ISO anymore. And this is a side effect of shooting H.264, H.265, or ProRes. You cannot change ISO after you've recorded. But when you're shooting RAW, when you're shooting native RAW on the camera, you can change ISO in post, and that is fantastic. It really, really helps you with your post workflow. Let's talk about color balance. The other benefit of shooting in RAW that you don't get with H.264 or ProRes is that you can adjust color balance in post-production. So color balance is making sure that the image is the correct color for the environment in which you're shooting. Sunlight tends to be very blue, so we want to capture a more orange image to make colors look natural. Tungsten light, indoor lights tend to be more yellow, so we pull the camera over to the blue spectrum so that when yellow light hits it, it looks correct. All I'm doing right now is changing the white balance on this. That's 2500 Kelvin is very, very blue. And there we have, 10,000 Kelvin, very, very orange. We're going to set that back to 48, which is 4850 is what we had this room kind of gray carded at. When you shoot non-RAW, you are committing to your white balance when you press record. When you shoot RAW, you can change that in post-production. So if your color balance feels off, you can adjust it in post-production. anyone who's spent any time in post knows that you can change your color balance in post-production if you've used Lumetri scope, or not scopes, but Lumetri color panel. You can nudge it blue, and you can nudge it orange, you can nudge it red, and you can nudge it green, whichever way you need it. But what I'd like to do is demonstrate how effective RAW can be at adjusting your color in post-production. We've got two color cards. On the left is Canon shooting 5600 Kelvin, and on the right is a Blackmagic shooting 5600 Kelvin. The Canon is shooting H.264, which is a very compressed codec, one that I would recommend against shooting if you have any options other than H.264 for image acquisition on set. That is kind of the worst one you can use. And on the right we have RAW, which is a much better codec for your on-set experience, for your post experience. What you're seeing right now is when they are both exposed correctly, they both look pretty good. The colors are rich, they're vibrant, they're accurate, and that's what we'd expect. So next slide you're going to see, we have taken those cameras and we've switched them over to 3200 Kelvin. And now you'll see the colors are washed out, they're more muted. That's correctly exposed, that's incorrectly exposed. They're washed out, they're muted, they're not correct. What we're going to do is take these incorrectly exposed images and we're going to pull them over to color correct them in post-production. So instead of doing it in camera before we hit record, we are doing this in post-production. And what you'll see is that the colors have become inaccurate for the Canon, but not for the Blackmagic. Because the Canon had this wrong information baked in, we were able to pull it, but you can only bend bad information so far. And that's what we're seeing there is washed out colors, loss of saturation, loss of vibrancy. And that is why when you're shooting H.264 or ProRes, you need to spend more time color balancing. You need to get a gray card before pretty much every shot if you want to have a chance of your footage looking good. Now this is apples to oranges right here. So what we're going to do is look at the Canon correctly color balanced on the left, and then the Canon incorrectly color balanced and then corrected on the right. And you see the little doodly bop robot in the left. The colors are completely off at this point. Those are not at all the accurate colors of that thing. And you can see it across the board. Like the colors are just off. And let's look at the Blackmagic. And what you'll notice here is that the two images are identical. The one on the left was correctly color balanced in camera at the time of recording. The one on the right was incorrectly color balanced and corrected in post. But what you see is that we have retained the 100% color accuracy, even though we incorrectly balanced the shot and then made massive changes to it in post. So you can see just how different those two images are and how identical those two images are. And that is the second benefit of shooting in RAW, is that you get this level of control of your color in post-production, even if you were wildly off when you were shooting on set. Let's move on. So the question is, do you have as much control with native ISO as you do with white balance? Or with the ISO in post-production as you do with white balance? You have a lot of control, not quite as much, and we'll get into why. If you're shooting on a camera that has a single native ISO, the answer is yes. But these are dual native ISO cameras, so the answer is sort of. Let's get into dual native ISO. This is something pretty clever, and it's becoming more common in prosumer and consumer grade cameras. This is the old system, analog gain with a native ISO of whatever it is, 400, 800. Actually, that camera I believe is 400 because they capped the ISO at 1600, so I'm guessing that's 800 or 400. Let's get into dual native ISO. This is a brilliant idea, amazing in its simplicity. Just add a second amplifier to your camera. So you have one amplifier that is operating at ISO 400 and another amplifier that is operating at 3200. The benefit of this is that the amplifier operating at 3200 will have less noise than if you took an amplifier operating at 800 and pulled it all the way to 3200. So you have so much more versatility when you have this dual native ISO system. It comes at a cost, and we're going to get into that cost in a moment. But first, we have to look at and understand Blackmagic exposure charts, or exposure charts in general. These might look a little technical and a little overwhelming at first, but we're going to break them down. So let's look at what we're looking at, and that is an exposure chart for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K. The same rules apply almost identically to the 6K. It is such a similar sensor that just assume that whatever I'm saying is true for the 4K, which is this one, is also true for the 6K, which is that one. Let's take a look at what we're looking at. At the bottom of the chart, we have ISO, and it goes from 100 to 1000. On the left, we've got stops, and in the center of that is 0. So you've got 0, and then you've got stops below 0 and stops above 0. And when Blackmagic says that their camera has 13 stops of dynamic range, that means you can see that there's about 7 below 0 and about 5 above 0. 5 plus 7 is 13. That's 13 stops of usable dynamic range is what they're talking about. And if it doesn't make sense now, it will make more sense as we get into the cameras and we see practical application. So just bear with me. Let's focus for a moment on ISO 400, which is the Blackmagic's native ISO. First thing you'll notice is that the split between the light gray and the dark gray is happening at 0. What that split is, those two are separated by middle gray. So everything that's darker gray, I disagree with how they designed this chart because I imagine they designed it without having to speak it. And you'll understand why in a moment. So the darker gray is the stuff that's lighter than middle gray. The lighter gray on this chart is the stuff that's darker than middle gray in the real world. I wish that they had just flipped those two grays because it would be easier to talk about. So everything in dark gray is information that's lighter than middle gray. And just so we know what we're talking about with middle gray, this is a reference point. This is a set gray. It reflects a set amount of light. And when you're buying a middle gray card, it's a very technical item. It's why they're so expensive. You can't just paint a piece of wood gray and hope that you're going to get middle gray. It's a very specific amount of reflectivity and a very specific amount of brightness to darkness ratio. So when you are at ISO 400 and your middle gray is correctly exposed, you have 5.5 stops of dynamic range above that middle gray and 7.6 stops of dynamic range below that middle gray. As you go to lower ISOs, what you'll see is that middle gray marker is getting bumped up and up the chart. As it goes higher up the chart, you need more light to get it to middle gray. You need more light to get it to middle gray. And as we go down the chart, you need less light to get it to middle gray. ISO 1000 is more sensitive than ISO 100. So at ISO 1000, you need less light than you do at ISO 100. And you can see this represented visually in the chart. As that middle gray goes down the chart, the brighter it gets, the less light you need to get middle gray at that exact value. What is the cost? This is the thing I was talking about a little bit earlier, that it seems like it would make sense that if you have your native ISO at 400, and as you attenuate signal, you're also attenuating noise. So why wouldn't you just attenuate that signal as low as you can go? This is why. As you can see, when we go down from ISO 400, we are moving that middle gray, and we are losing data space for your highlights. When you're at ISO 100, you have less data space allocated for highlights and more data space allocated for shadows. There's a ceiling on how much data you can put into any one frame, and it just allocates more for the shadows than it does for the highlights. So you're losing information as you attenuate that signal. And the opposite is true at the high end of your ISOs when you're at the 400 sensor, or the 400 amp. You'll see that as we go up to ISO 1000, we have 6.8 stops of information in the highlights, but we have lost information in the shadows. So this is where things get a little bit weird when you're using Blackmagic RAW. This is one of the major idiosyncrasies that you need to be aware of. If you were shooting sunny clouds on film, your correct instinct would be to go to the lowest ISO that you can find, because that will give you the most picture information and the most kind of arm room to work as you're working with bright environments. This is not true for Blackmagic RAW. If you want to go out and shoot images of clouds that are backlit by the sun, you want to be in ISO 1000 because it allocates so much more information to the highlights than it does to the shadows. If you're shooting something shadowy, a dark environment, you want to be at ISO 100 because it allocates so much more information to the lowlights. This is completely inverted from the world of film and from traditional thinking when you have like a single native ISO. The way they allocate data to different kinds of light is very, very specific and very idiosyncratic. But it's also understandable, because last thing we're going to look at in this chart is the fact that there's a ceiling and a floor to all of this information. That's because all signals can clip. Whether you're working in digital or analog recording, all signals can clip. There's a ceiling to how much information you can record, and there's a floor to how much information to what kinds of information you can record. These cameras are no different. What you're seeing is that as we adjust from 400 to 320 to 100 to 1000, the ceiling has remained the same because that ceiling was determined at the analog gain. The floor is remaining the same because that floor was determined at the analog gain level. And what we're doing is applying digital gain and digital attenuation to a fixed signal. And it helps to take this out of the theoretical and into the actual camera. So what we're going to do is switch over. We're on the Blackmagic 4K up on the screen now. And we've got, this is false color. So what this is doing is telling us which part of the image is, which parts of the image are correctly exposed, which parts are underexposed, and which parts are overexposed. So stuff that's green and pink, that's correctly exposed. Stuff that's red is overexposed. And you can see like a couple of blue lines once we get into the, kind of the rafters and the shadows of the rafters. We've got some blue there, and that's underexposed. So what I'm going to do now with this camera is adjust the ISO. And as I do, what you're going to notice is that the green and the pink will change. See how as I bring the ISO down, the image is becoming underexposed. The green is more confined to those very highlighty areas around that skylight. And as I bring the ISO up, the parts that are more in the shadows are becoming properly exposed. I'm going to turn off false color and do that again, okay? So you see we've got plenty of usable information in all of the roof right now, but as we come down, we lose too much information and we can't really see clearly what's going on in the roof. As we go back up, we have usable information again. But as we go down, we lose that information. I'm going to do that same motion again, but with the false color on so you can see how these colors react. We're going back up, and you can see the green spreading out, and the pink is spreading out and spreading out. And that means that we've got good information there. Now I'd like to draw your attention to the skylight. As I adjust this, the skylight never changes. That's because the skylight is clipped at the analog gain level. And what you're seeing there is a visual representation of that ceiling on the top of the chart there. There's just no information above that ceiling. Whether we take it to ISO 100 or ISO 1000, the information simply isn't there. Let's go back, and what we're going to do is try, I don't know if, I can't promise that this will work, but we're going to try to get that skylight correctly exposed. And I'm going to do that by bringing down the iris. So we're going to bring that down and bring that down. Now, as I bring down the iris, you see how we're getting the information back in there. Because the iris is physically closing down and letting less light onto the sensor plate, we can actually change that. All right, so that's what we're talking about when we look at that chart and we see that there's a ceiling and a floor. Any information that doesn't exist below that floor cannot exist at 100. It cannot exist at 1000. Anything that's above that ceiling can't exist at 100. It can't exist at 1000. It was lost before we got into ISO changes. I think tucked into that is the question of where do you put your ISO? Like, what should you use? The native is the best. It will get you the highest quality image with the best balance between shadows and highlights. If you look at ISO 100, we have very little information allocated to the highlights and way too much allocated to the shadows. If you're shooting something low light and you really want that extra detail in the shadows, know how to use 100. 100 would be useful for that. If you want to shoot bright, beautiful clouds that are backlit by the sun, know to use 1000. Like 1000 will give you some tools that 400 and 100 won't give you. 100 gives you some tools that 400 and 1000 won't give you. If you aren't planning specifically for that kind of shot, go for the native ISO. And this will end up being the difference between cheap looking footage and a movie that looks, and footage that looks good. So you can take your camera and bend your camera to the light that you were given. Or you can choose your camera and light your environment in a way that suits your camera the best. And that's the difference. That's the whole difference between footage that looks good and footage that looks cheap and amateurish, is when you take a camera and bend it to what you've been given, it's gonna look lame. When you build your environment and you build your shoot around the nuances of the camera that you've chosen, you can get amazing, these will look better than a $50,000 red if you're using the red incorrectly and you're using these correctly. Let's take a look at 3200, and I want to speed this up. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds. Anything 8000 and above, please don't worry about, never switch these cameras to 8000 and above. The footage will be useless. But let's go to that, and we're just going to crank this up to maximum and stop down. You seeing all that noise? I don't like noise like that. I really don't, and it's hard to work with that image. Okay, so here we are at ISO 3200. Native is 3200, but you'll notice everything is a mess here. Middle gray is nowhere near 0. Things get wonky once you get past 1250. But you will notice that in general, there's a similar ceiling and a similar floor from 1250 to 6400. And that's why we don't go past 6400, is because after that, it gets really software based. It is not nearly so much hardware based as 1250 to 64 or 100 to 1000. But you'll see the same trend here where there's less information in the highlights and more information in the shadows at 1250. And the inverse is true over at 6400, and your ideal balance of highlight shadows is at 3200. That said, we usually shoot at 1250 instead of 3200 because there is noise, there is grain at 3200, and we like to attenuate it. We are usually shooting lower light environments when we use 1250, so it's good to have that extra information in the shadows, and then if we do need to brighten it up, we can kick up to 1600 or 2000 or beyond. One more little idiosyncrasy. to be aware of as you jump from the 400 amplifier to the 3200 amplifier is you will notice that there's a lot of information in the highlights at 1000, not much in the shadows at 1000, and then when you pop over to 1250, there's so much in the shadows and not much in the highlights. And you will notice this as you switch between 1000 and 1250, you will see not a wild, it's not gonna like blast your hair back, but you will notice a change in the balance of shadows and highlights and what you have to work with and what you don't have to work with.